Ora si
Antonio and
registrerà la conferenza.
okay, perfect.
Go Alice, you can do the introduction.
Yeah, so I want to firstly thank you, Pasquale from Archimede Solutions and Antonio Landi from the Istituto Italiano Privacy to be here in order to present us the report on safety and liability on artificial intelligence, Internet of Things and robotics, which is another of the documentation produced by the European Commission in this period, together with the European Commission white paper presented on the AI. And this is another initiative that falls into the creation of a European a common European data strategy. So I leave the floor to Pasquale to introduce the topic, and then to Antonio to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you very much to the Istituto Italiano Privacy that with Archimede Solution in the context of the Coordination and Support Action NGIOT is bringing this webinar to existence. This is a series of webinars that we have organized. As our participants know, this webinar is recorded, so we assume their consent for the registration. If they don't want to be recorded, they can just skip and not attend the seminar. And all the seminars are available on the NGIOT website. So in case they have lost other webinars, they can just go there and go through the webinars. This is important because especially the last webinars that we have organized are strongly interconnected also as far as the current EU policy cycle is concerned. So I would classify today's webinar as part 2 as taking into account the AI white paper. It is a previous webinar that we have organized, and in fact the report that we are discussing today is part of the AI white paper, which of course is strongly connected with the EU data strategy, which, as we know, is currently under discussion also because of the very strong developments that we have seen in the recent days, frankly, which will probably shape the data strategy. As we all know, many of our organizations are participating to the consultation of the European Commission, both on the data strategy and to the AI white paper. We aim as NGIOT and as Work Package 2 to contribute to that consultation as well. So this kind of conversations that we are having in the context of the webinars is very important for us to work on our ideas and on the kind of contribution we want to bring there. Now, probably all of you are familiar with the EU approach on AI is highlighted in the white paper. What are the benefits of AI? Why AI is important? Because the volume of data that also the new enabling technologies are going to bring available, and what are the potential risks on AI? And this is especially important for the issue on discussion on safety and liability that you are having today. And we all know, if we take into account the IoT policy framework, how much trust in IoT is a prerequisite to enable adoption of IoT technologies from end users. And the discussion on safety and liability is really like in the middle of this kind of trust framework for IoT. What is the vision behind the report on safety and liability of the European Commission, which is basically attached to the white paper? The kind of vision that you have there is that the overall objective of safety and liability legal framework is to ensure that all products and services, including those integrating emerging digital technology, operate safely, reliably, and consistently, and the damage having occurred is remedied efficiently. And here you have in this picture, this is a picture taken from the Create IoT legal framework, which is very important because here you have a kind of idea of the kind of different layers of legislation which are involved in IoT. So a strong base, which is given by the GDPR, which is the buzzword, of course, that many of you, also non-legal experts, are very familiar with at this point. But then, especially as far as safety and liability and the different verticals are concerned, you end up in having very specific sectorial regulations. So one thing is the kind of, I don't know, the medical directive, Another thing is the kind of legislation that you deal with if you work in smart cities, and another thing is if you work in Internet of Food. Now, as we will see today, and at the general level, when we speak about safety and liability, you really need to take into account the specific sectorial regulation, because you don't find the different norms in the GDPR here. So you need to go sectorial and see the different kind of legislation which are available and relevant in your vertical. The European Commission communication on building trust in human-centric AI, the Commission also published sets of guidelines on that, states that AI should integrate safety and security by design mechanisms to ensure that they are verifiable, safe at every step, taking into heart the physical and mental safety of all concerned. Now, on safety, we see the same discussion that we see on privacy, in the sense that when you are dealing with safety or when you are dealing with data protection, it's not something that you have to do ex post, but it's something that you need to embed since the beginning in the conception of the tool on which you are working on. And you will see how here, and the Commission stresses this in this report, then the role is not only the role of data controllers, but there should be a strong interaction between data controllers and manufacturers of the different tools. So, as far as product safety legislation is concerned, the first thing that we have to have in mind is that a big portion of the EU product safety framework was written prior to the emergence of digital technologies. This is why in the data strategy, the European Commission is pushing for the adoption of new regulation. Now, usually when we hear the words new regulations, we are afraid because we say, oh, okay, other burdens that will, discourage developers to innovate, which, I mean, partially sometimes is true. But as far as safety is concerned and safety legislation is concerned, it's true that we need to update the current regulations because, I mean, there has been so much innovation in the recent years that we have to keep up with the world as it is today. And in that kind of sector, a role has been played recently in standardization. I would say the report highlights the role of European standardization. There has also been an important role of global standardization. So if you see what ISO or ITU have done recently, then you have seen developments also there. And as far as European standardization is concerned, we will be dealing with this in the next webinar. ETSI has produced a set of guidelines at the end of February, which are really very relevant for this. If you have not done so, have a look at that. There has been a special task force which has worked in the context of ETSI to produce an important set of documents for IoT guidelines, risk assessment, and so on. We will deal with this in the next webinar with Emmanuel Darmois, which has been heavily working in that task force. This is the kind of product safety legislation framework that the report highlights. You see, it's a very complex framework which involves design and manufacturing. It involves market placement of the products. It involves essential safety requirements. It involves assessment procedures. It involves, of course, certification, and are important buzzwords, both as far as data protection is concerned, so GDPR certification, but also certification and conformity assessment from the point of view of product safety legislation. And you see here at the bottom of the picture the different kind of EU safety legislation that you need to consider according to the kind of different verticals in which you're working. So if you're working on e-health, of course you need to know what the medical devices directive provides for, or the machinery directive, radio equipment directive, toy safety directive, or if you're working in the automotive vehicle approval legislation. This is a topic of discussion in many countries today. So it's a kind of quite complex legal framework. And at the end of this, and Antonio will discuss that, then you have the liability regime, which of course is also important because in the context of the liability regime, you have to assess also cost implied in the liability regime. Now, one thing which has been also heavily discussed, I attended, some of you might have been there in Brussels in the last big also Create IoT event, is the concept of safety. Any kind of IT specialist will tell you that, zero risk or total safety does not exist. So when you work on safety, you have to consider several strands of safety. So it involves protecting against all kind of risk arising from the product, including not only mechanical, chemical, electrical, but also cyber risks, and in the context of IoT, risk related to the loss of connectivity of devices. The report, the Commission report, stresses that in this context there might be the need for specific provision to be considered in this respect in the new and upcoming legislation in order to allow and provide for a better protection of users. So we will see if in the next and upcoming Data Protection Act, in data strategies foreseen for 2021, we will find some kind of new provision in there as far as safety is also concerned. The report also includes a reflection on what is called safety risk assessment. And what is a safety risk assessment? In the data protection scenario, you have a data protection impact assessment. Many of you are, of course, familiar with that. When we discuss safety, we need to have safety risk assessment, and safety risk assessment should focus on the safety impact caused by autonomous behavior through the product lifetime. The risk assessment should be performed by a appropriate economic operator, and in addition, the report stressed the relevant union piece of legislation could include reinforcement requirements for manufacturer on instruction and warning of users. So again, the report stressed the important interconnection and there is between manufacturers, data controllers, and users. There are, of course, and there might be specific norms for AI. So the Commission imagines explicit obligation of producers, AI minority robots to explicitly consider the material harm that their product could cause to users, in particular vulnerable users such as elderly person in care environments. So health it's an important concern in this kind of scenario. One important thing stressed in the report, and this is a direct link with AI, the transparency of algorithms. So we have seen in some countries, for instance, we have seen this in Italy in the context of schools, that algorithms have been put in place, and through these algorithms, the algorithm may have assigned, for instance, teachers to certain places around the countries, but the transparency of the criteria for the algorithms have been not made clear, and then at the end in court it was discovered that the algorithm was discriminatory. So the report clearly stressed the needs for the transparency of algorithms, accountability, and human oversight, and on unbiased outcomes. This is very important for AI mechanisms. So, and the Commission stressed in the report that one way of tackling different challenges would be to impose obligation on developers of the algorithm, so to disclose the design parameters and metadata of datasets in case accidents, of course. One thing which I want to stress very strongly, because it also interrelates again with data protection situation, is the cooperation which is stressed by the Commission between the economic operators in the supply chain and the users in order to provide legal certainty. Now, we have, for instance, and we have to imagine this, a data protection framework which is heavily centered on data controllers and the role of the data controllers have. But sometimes, take for instance the case of smart cities, the kind of control the data controllers have is strongly influenced by the kind of products that you use in a smart city. So sometimes, even if you want to offer high standard of data protection, the kind of standard that you can offer, it really depends on the kind of public procurement that you do and the kind of products that you use in order to enable the deployment of your IoT devices. So the kind of legal framework is a little bit imbalanced there, because it puts all the stress on data controllers and not so much on the producers. So having a coordination between product safety legislation and data protection here could also enable a stronger data protection, because it puts the burden of responsibility both on data controllers and producers and manufacturers of IoT devices. And my idea is that this is the kind of thing that the Commission is stressing a little bit in this report, and it's very relevant for IoT deployment, which is really the core of our interest here. Now, of course, and I will give the floor to Antonio, what happens when safety is not in place and is not guaranteed, then liability and liability regimes enter there. I just want to conclude this presentation give the floor to Antonio to tell you that submission on the different white papers can still be made. May 31st is for the data strategy, and June 14 is for the AI white paper. So I know that many of you are involved in research projects, and I think it would be good, the more kind of submission the Commission gets, the better it is. So thank you very much for your attention, and Antonio, I give you the floor on the liability. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you hear me. First of all, I would like to thank Pasquale and Alice for the invitation, allowing me the opportunity to analyze the liability implication of AI, IoT, and robotics. The topic of liability is strictly connected with that one of safety, already addressed by Pasquale. In fact, the main goal of the liability legal framework is to create a robust mechanism to remedy the occurred damage that contributes to better protect consumers. It also creates trust in these technologies that is a prerequisite for their dissemination by industry and users. I don't know if Alicia is...
Yeah, okay. Can you, are you seeing something or not? Because I'm just trying to put the presentation on the screen.
Yeah, you have to open it.
Yes.
I have opened it on my computer, but I see that you can see only the first little things. So I have to do something else, I think. Okay, great. Because I have opened on my PC the PowerPoint, but I can see that you cannot see it, so I'm just wondering why.
Maybe you're working with multiple screens?
Yeah, no, I'm only on one screen at the moment, so I thought that was the point, but it doesn't seem.
But
so,
we see your screen, Alice, but it seems that the PowerPoint is not open.
Yeah, but yeah, actually I've opened it, so this is strange. Maybe there is a different control on different windows on my computer. Is it possible? Yeah, 20, no. Okay, okay, I found, yeah, okay, it's here, because you can choose which application. So now, something changed? Nothing.
I don't know if Pasquale has the presentation, maybe you can, because I...
Oh. Yeah, now maybe now.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Sorry for the mistake. Okay, perfect.
So I will start again. So the topic of liability is strictly connected with that one of safety already addressed by Pasquale. In fact, the main goal of the liability legal framework is to create a robust mechanism to remedy the damage occurred that contributes to better protect consumers. It also creates trust in these technologies that is a prerequisite for their dissemination by industry and users. If we move on the next slide, one of the main topics is the fragmentation at national level. National harmonized regimes provide fault-based liability rules, according to which victims of damage need to prove their fault of the liability person, the damage, and causality between the fault and the damage in order to establish a successful liability claim. They also provide strict liability regimes where the national legislator has attributed liability for a risk to a specific person without the need for a victim to prove the effect or causality between the effect and the damage. This, of course, could discourage investments as well as increase information and insurance costs for producers and other businesses in the supply chain, especially European small-medium enterprises. In addition, I think that it is important in this case to fix rules that allow companies to know their liability risks through the value chain, giving them the opportunity to reduce or prevent them. In this way, companies may insure themselves efficiently against these risks. Moving on, the next slide is focused on the Product Liability Directive that was the main legal framework in EU concerning the liability. This directive was adopted to provide a layer protection that national fault-based liability alone does not provide. The directive tried to respond to certain needs, in particular ensure a high degree of consumer protection against damages to health and property caused by a defective product. Also, it ensures producers' liability for damage caused by a defective product and increase the free movement of products without distorting competition by setting a common rule on strict liability of the producers. Although the definition of product in the Product Liability Directive is broad, its scope could be further clarified to better reflect the complexity of these new emerging technologies and ensure that compensation is always available for damage caused by products that are defective because of software or other digital features. This would better enable economic actors, such as software developers, to assess whether they could be considered producers according to the Product Liability Directive. If we move on the next slide, the applicability of motor vehicle insurance rules to producers could be a good solution in this area of business, because it grants liability of producers. That could be that one of the setting of a way to grant liability of producers could be that one of setting a compulsory insurance for producers of AI and new technologies in order to allow individuals to understand which is the first point of claim for compensation for personal injury or material damage. According to such a structure, the obligatory insurance compensates the victim and protects the producers who are liable under national civil law rules. Taking out proper insurance, in fact, can mitigate the negative consequences of accidents by providing for a smooth compensation for the victims. Clear liability rules also help insurance companies to calculate the risks and to claim reimbursement from the party held liable for damage. It is also important to avoid less protection. In fact, the characteristics of emerging digital technologies challenge aspects of union and national liability frameworks and could reduce their effectiveness. Some of these characteristics could make it hard to trace the damage back to a human behavior, which could give grounds for a fault-based claim in accordance with national rules. This means that liability claims based on national tort law may be difficult or even very expensive to prove, and consequently victims may not be sufficiently compensated. Moving on, the next slide is focused on the burden of proof. The Commission is seeking views whether and to what extent it may be needed to mitigate the consequences of complexity by alleviating or reversing the burden of proof required by national liability rules for damage caused by the operation of AI application through an appropriate EU initiative. In addition, it will be necessary also to set up clear cybersecurity measures. Cybersecurity weaknesses may exist from the outset when a product is put into circulation, but they may also appear at a later stage after the product was put into circulation. Under the Product Liability Directive, the question if a producer could have foreseen certain changes taking account of the product's reasonably predictable use, this is the main topic, may become in the future more prominent. For example, there could be an increase in the use of the later defect defense, according to which a producer is not liable if the defect did not exist at the time when the product was put into circulation or in the development risk defense. In addition, liability could be reduced where the injured party does not perform safety relevant updates. This could be considered as a contributory negligence by the injured person and therefore reduce the producer's liability. Moving on, the next slide analyzes the so-called black box effect. Due to the black box effect, in fact, in some AI, getting compensation could become difficult for damage caused by autonomous AI application. In fact, the need to understand the algorithm and the data used by the AI requires analytical capacity and technical expertise that victims could find too expensive to prove. In addition, access to the algorithm and the data could be impossible without the cooperation of the potentially liable party. In practice, victims may not be able to make a liability claim. Therefore, we can focus on a risk-based approach. In fact, the risk-based approach could mainly concern AI devices that move in public spaces, for example, fully autonomous vehicles, drones, and package delivery robots, or AI-based services with similar risks, for example, traffic management service guiding or controlling vehicles, or management of power distribution. For the operation of AI applications with a specific risk profile, the Commission is evaluating whether and to what extent strict liability may be needed in order to achieve effective compensation of possible victims. The Commission is also evaluating of matching strict liability with a possible obligation to conclude available insurance following the example of the Motor Insurance Directive that I have already analyzed. For the operation of all other AI applications that are the majority of AI applications, the Commission is reflecting whether the burden of proof concerning causation and fault needs to be updated. Moving to the conclusions, in order to achieve the harmonization and spread the development of these technologies in the EU digital single market, I think that the following solution that I listed could be followed. In particular, updating the legislative tool. Maybe it could be useful to shift from a directive to a regulation, as already happened with the personal data and privacy, with the shift from the directive to the GDPR. With the e-privacy directive that is going to be replaced by the e-privacy regulation, maybe also in this case it would be appropriate to use a regulation to avoid fragmentation that could arise from national member state legislation, updating in particular the old concepts of producer, product, defect, and the exemptions and the other elements that are analyzed and regulated by the Product Liability Directive. In addition, I think that the certainty of liability should be addressed with the creation of a unique center of liability, avoiding the so-called black box effect. In fact, due to the complexity of these technologies, it would be unclear how to demonstrate the fault of an AI acting autonomously, and therefore victims may not be able to make a liability claim. For this reason, I suggest to create a unique center of liability through a tendering procedure for the creation, for example, of an IoT area or AI product, through which the winner of the tender will be considered liable for the damage caused by all the technology present in that area, even if different producers cooperated with the creation of the IoT environment. Another important measure could be the compulsory insurance that I have already addressed, following the example of the Motor Insurance Directive. In fact, this compulsory insurance, in my opinion, should be applied without distinction based on risk profile of an AI application, because we know that AI acting autonomously may be designed for a certain scope, but at the end may act totally different, so it is difficult, or maybe in some cases impossible, to assess the risk of profile at the moment of the creation of the solution. The clear cybersecurity obligation was already analyzed, and these rules allowing, of course, operators to determine what they have to do in order to avoid consequences of liability, fixing the minimum standards for these technologies. And last but not least, later defect defense. In fact, producers' liability could be reduced where the injured party does not perform relevant updates. I think this should be considered as a pro-business measure, because the contributory negligence by the injured party, for example, in the case when the user does not download the latest version of the software, should reduce the liability of the producer. Of course, the cases of contributory negligence should be clearly fixed since the beginning and known by the users. Well, I've finished my presentation, so I leave the floor back to Pasquale and Alicia, or to some questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We have, let's say, 15 minutes for somebody that wants to intervene or raise some points. So we are not too many today compared to the other sessions. So just raise your hand so that you have the floor. I don't know if the people who have been attending or Alicia herself wants to say something.
Thank you, Pasquale. And I really invite also the participant to take part in this little floor, because I think it's really important to share different ideas, not only report ideas, as also Antonio tried to do today. So if someone want to,
in case I want to say one thing, Alice, to see what Antonio, I don't know what do you think of this, but by reading the different documents, I clearly see that the Commission is pushing toward this interaction between the safety and liability regime and the data protection regime, and they see the two as strongly interconnected. Have you made up the same kind of idea?
Yes, I agree with you. I think that this shift is necessary to develop a structure and a legal framework, as I addressed at the beginning, that can allow the spread of these new technologies, because due to the fact that these technologies are very complex, interconnected, and it's difficult to readdress the supply chain that involved all the processing activities and strictly connected liability. I think that having a legal framework that can address the main principle through which the rules of the game, through which the producers or in general operators may work, is a great idea, a good solution in order to allow the spread of these technologies.
But do you see the same kind of interconnection also, for instance, between the kind of certification regimes, in a sense? Because we know that in data protection, of course, certification is an important request coming especially from big players. And do you see the kind of interconnection between data protection certification and safety certification there?
Yeah, in some cases, yes. Certification, yes, of course, could allow the operators, the business to assess their compliance before starting. So could be a good starting point to allow the spread of products and services in a compliant way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, also the part, I think also the part on the risk assessment is really, really close to the DPIA, for example, that is now active on data protection regulation. So it's really interesting how the Commission is trying to use the legislative instruments already present in order to address the issues of these new technologies. The main question, the natural question is, are they sufficient, and are they effectively, I don't know, are they effective instrument that can guarantee the objectives also for these new technologies? I mean, for example, the black box effect is impossible really to understand because of its nature. So, I mean, maybe other instruments would be more efficient to handle these new technologies now. So, I don't know if someone in the public, in our between our listener now has already tried to think about different ideas or legal instrument, or also not legal instrument, because I think this is the main point. Not all the issues can be solved with the legal instrument, maybe. I don't know if someone wants to share.
I think that when you take the instruments, like you take a DPIA and you take a safety risk assessment, you cannot mobilize only legal expert there, because especially if you do a safety risk assessment, you need to mobilize IT specialists and so on. So you need, in any case, a kind of interdisciplinary approach to this.
Sure.
Yes, for sure.
Just this is Salvatore Scalzo.
Yes.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
From the European Commission, Unity, Internet of Things. No, just to perhaps provide a word of clarification, because of course I heard with interest. Thank you very much for the extremely good initiative and the presentation. Just let's say you made a link between data protection certification and safety certification. I would say that the issue of data protection certification as such remains a bit outside, I would say, if not entirely outside of the scope of the document and the report, in the sense that, of course, data protection certification is a process which can be established under the relevant rules of the GDPR, but it is certainly not something which falls under the scope of the initiatives launched by the report and envisaged in the report. So what is crucial that we have really to highlight is that the report aims to address the current union safety and union, also as you say, and the liability framework. So try to find targeted solutions for new technologies. I would say really the data protection certification, which is actually not even mandatory, but to possibly be established according to the rules of the GDPR, is really something separated from the discussion and the intention of the report. So I wanted really just to provide this clarification. I see where you come from, of course, but let's say they are really two separate things. Okay.
No, just Salvatore, if I can just clarify that I totally agree with what you said, but what I was trying to understand if there was in any case a kind of intellectual link, not a link in the report as such, in a kind of establishing a framework for trust, where you can have different pieces of this framework, and
I see. Yeah.
Conformity assessment certification is one piece of the puzzle, and then data protection certification is another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I would say that certainly, I mean, there is certainly the intention from the Commission in general terms to establish possibly, let's say, a high level of data protection also in relation to data that train artificial intelligence, for example. Yeah. And this is not a topic which is addressed specifically within the report. I would say that this is more specifically mentioned and possibly addressed in the future in the context of the data strategy and the AI white paper, because of course, I mean, in particular the initiative on AI, which is outlined, so the possible future AI framework, could indeed also look at how the training data which are used by manufacturers, what are the requirements that those training data would be expected to comply. So this is certainly an aspect which the Commission will look at, but this arises from the AI white paper. So that's why I kept it separate methodologically from the issues addressed in the report.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Thank you for the intervention. Alice.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting the position Salvatore shares with us in order to better understand and clearly separate the issues. And so thank you. I think we can, I don't know if someone, I push a bit for questions because it really enrich this moment, I think. I don't know. I try again.
Yeah,
Any questions?
what I want to say, this kind of conversation is also relevant for the work we plan to do for submission to the consultation. So I take the opportunity to thank Salvatore as well.
Yeah, so yeah, I appreciate the fact that you underline also the two public consultation deadlines, one in June the 14th and the other one in May the 31st, because I think as I said already in our previous webinar, it is a great opportunity also for us to give an aid to institutions commission to work better and to address effectively the issues. So yeah.
I think if we are there, we can conclude here. And the people who are participating in the IoT security cluster, we have people from there and other people which have been part of the AG Finance On will receive a communication for our next webinar that will be with Emmanuel Darmois, which has worked on the ETSI task force, and will present to us some of the relevant documents that they have produced, and they were presented in Brussels in the meeting which was held at the end of February, but probably some of you were not there, and there were some people that want more information on there, and Emmanuel agreed to be with us in our next webinar. So I thank you very much for being with us, also on behalf of NGIOT, Work Package 2, Archimede Solution on my side, and Alice from Istituto Italiano Privacy, which has co-hosted with me today's event, and we look forward to see you in our next webinar. You will receive a communication on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pasquale.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.